Welcome to this Normative webinar on unintentional greenwashing and how to avoid it. My name is Maria Rincon, Social Media Manager with Normative. Today's webinar will uncover what exactly greenwashing is, what are the wide-ranging business consequences of it, and how to avoid the most common traps. Our panel of experts from Normative include our Head of Science and Research, Dr. Alexander Schmidt, and our Climate Strategy Advisors, Lucia Bookman and Zimisiej Veskovich. And just some housekeeping before we begin. So you're welcome to use the Q&A function throughout the webinar to ask any questions you may have, and we'll bring these to the panel at the end of the discussion. If for any time constraints we don't get to all the questions, we'll be sure to reach out after the webinar with the answers. All right, so before we set the floor, I wanted to share that before I joined Normative, I didn't know a lot about greenwashing. So let's start with a poll question, and if you're ready to answer it, the question is, do you know how to spot greenwashing? Yes, no, or I don't know. So let's give everyone a bit of time to answer that and click. Right, so the question is, do you know how to spot greenwashing? Yes, no, or I don't know. All right, let's bring up the answers soon. Okay, 47% yes, 21% no, and 31% I don't know. So we have audiences that know, some that don't, and we're all here to learn some more. So yes, identifying and spotting greenwashing is tricky, and hopefully today we can find some more tools to help us identify greenwashing. Okay, so before we get started, I would like to share a little bit about Normative with you. So Normative was founded in 2014, and we're the world's first carbon accounting engine. We help businesses calculate their entire climate footprint, engage their value chain in CO2 reduction. We share this journey with customers and stakeholders, and we help them become compliant in this carbon legislation environment. Here's a look at our clients and our impact. So we work with clients all over in different industries, and everything we do is based on the GHG protocol as a global standard to ensure transparency. We're powered by our market-leading emissions database, setting a new standard in scientific accuracy for emissions accounting, and we work directly with the UN and key policymakers to steer the global climate agenda. All right, before I hand it over to our experts, I'd like to ask you one more poll question. So recently, the European Commission came out with a percentage of greenwashing claims on business websites that were incorrect or misleading. Can you guess what this percentage is? So please answer the poll question that comes up on the screen if you'd like. What percentage of greenwashing claims has the European Commission found on business websites that are incorrect or misleading? A, 13%, B, 27%, or C, 42%? Right, let's wait in for those answers. And let's reveal the correct answer. Correct answer is 42%, and 80% of our audience has guessed that right. So congratulations. I mean, it's definitely not a number to celebrate. And that's why we have these webinars here informing us about unintentional greenwashing and why it's so important to have this conversation. All right, so now I'd like to invite our Head of Science and Research, Dr. Alexander Schmidt, to give us the what, who, and why of greenwashing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me well. It's great to see that through the poll, we have an audience that is already quite engaged with the topic, as it seems. Nevertheless, I still think it's super important, because those questions were obviously quite high level, that we set this scene right, that we actually have a common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about greenwashing. This term is all around the media. We have, for example, stories like these ones here that we collected for you, popping up all over the news. And it is easy enough to get stuck into those. Most of the time, those stories, those headlines, they promise to reveal the latest scams, the evil masterminds behind those schemes. And I think most of us are then maybe reminded of financial frauds that have been revealed and convicted in the past, such as Enron or more recently Wirecard. But the problem, of course, is greenwashing is different, and greenwashing has quite a quite a breadth to it. So let us just take a step back and see how would we actually, or how could we actually define greenwashing to begin with. Now, one of the definitions that you will find, one commonly used one, is greenwashing is disinformation disseminated by an organization so as to present an environmentally responsible public image. So that's a mouthful, and let's quickly just unpack this a bit. It's about disinformation of the public, about the company's environmental progress or progress in the area of sustainability. Now, of course, the problem is the goalpost is moving. We have regulations that are evolving rapidly. We have companies setting more and more ambitious targets around net zero, for example, and those have all shades and colors. So it is difficult to say, well, this exactly is greenwashing. Where do we draw the line? At the same time, and that's the tricky thing here, at the same time, greenwashing allegations, and even if it's just an allegation without being proven, quote unquote, greenwashing can have real world business consequences for those companies that are accused of doing this. So we have these two moving forces of standards that are evolving, and yet you will face real world consequences. So that's why in our webinar here, we have divided into two parts. So the first one that I'm happily now walking you through is about setting the scene, setting a few examples, sharing a few examples of what can happen if your company is accused of greenwashing. And then we're going to highlight together with our colleagues and experts the most commonly observed traps that companies fall in again and again, and of course, how you can avoid those. All right. It's very important for this next examples that I'm walking through to quickly just say, I do not intend to finger point at any of those organizations. This is just meaning to show you a few use cases that help you to get a better understanding of what actually are the consequences that businesses are facing, especially, of course, enterprises and larger businesses. The first one, probably most obvious one, is around financial risk. Recently in the US, BNY Mellon, the investment bank, has been fined $1.5 million for wrong or misstatements around the ESG investments and funds. Now, this was linked to them not having screened all of their, quote unquote, ESG funds and investments. They haven't done the due diligence on those. So there might be some in there that actually do not meet the ESG criteria. Interestingly, we see very similar cases right now under investigation by Goldman Sachs and also Deutsche Bank. So this is a very, very common thing we observe in the financial sector, but also, of course, beyond that. Greenwashing can have real-world financial risks for your company. Very closely linked to this are legal risks. I was just alluding to this before. The regulatory environment, it is evolving rapidly. It is quite confusing, to be honest. And that's also why we had a few weeks back a webinar dedicated only to the topic where we were outlining EU, UK, and US regulations and where they might be moving, because obviously you can't just look at what is happening right now. You have to look into the future and prepare your business as well. And then we brought out a tool, the carbon legislation tracker, to help you to stay actually on track, just because it's so complex. And the company Total Energies, they have fallen into one of those traps, if you want. So they have set net zero targets. This is not directly the same, obviously, as a regulatory framework, but they said themselves they want to go net zero by 2050. At the same time, they were heavily investing and expanding their offerings, you can say, in fossil fuels, among others with a billion-dollar project even in Uganda. So they are now facing the lawsuit of making wrong claims and misleading the public about the statement of actually being intentional about moving to net zero by 2050. And of course, very closely linked to this, and one of the things I want to highlight throughout these slides with these headlines I put up there, legal lawsuits in general, they will also carry reputational risks. And that is one of the, I think, most frightening factors of greenwashing allegations that many large enterprises are seeing themselves confronted with. Now, I picked one example that is actually already a bit older, but to make the point exactly because it's already from 2015, I think, were the first revelations around the VW emissions cheating scandal. And yet still, now even 7 years in, we still see and associate VW with manipulating the devices that measure the emissions coming from the tailpipes of the vehicles. And I mean, besides all of the financial damage that VW had to pay to get out of this scandal, and their stock price is still below the 2015 level. Besides all of those hard facts, if you want, they are still battling, and probably most of you as well who are associating VW with this scandal and might form a different opinion of this company just because of this revelation. Now, what does this leave us with? We have these three major risks, but why are companies still falling, are being accused of greenwashing, and why have they not recognized yet the importance of this? Well, let's quickly look at the positive side of why companies would sincerely try to behave more environmentally friendly or engage in business practices that are more sustainable. The facts, I think, by now are clear and undebatable. There are real world business implications in a positive sense, opportunities there for a company. Their market is huge. There have been a lot of investments being done and will continue to be taken in the market. Investors will pay premium for companies with a positive ESG record, and more than 2/3 of workers or employees, potential employees, they want to work for a company that is more environmentally sustainable and has a more sustainable business model. Now, at the same time, of course, where there are incentives, there might be bad actors out there that want to exploit these. But very important to stress here, this is just difficult to achieve. So even though you might not fall on the side of, I want to free ride on an environmental label, so to speak, that I put on my company without actually doing the hard work, companies are struggling that have the sincerest of intentions. They are struggling to actually get this right. And this is part of what we want to look into in the next chapter of this webinar, where we're going to outline some of the most commonly observed traps of greenwashing.
Thank you, Alex. Now we're going to move into part number 2, which is avoiding the greenwashing traps. So here at Normative, we came up with 5 of the most common unintentional greenwashing traps, and I'm going to invite our climate strategy advisor, Lucia, to go over trap number 1 and 2.
Hey everyone. The first trap that I would like to speak about is targets not based on carbon law. It is crucial to align targets with the latest sustainability science and carbon legislation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in short, the IPCC, stressed that global warming needs to be limited to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And this goes hand in hand with a minimum annual reduction of 4.2%, but ideally around 6.5% of linear annual reduction is needed. And organizations such as the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, are already acting upon this. So from the 15th of July, the pathway to set targets in line with staying well below 2 degrees is no longer an option. Now companies need to follow the 1.5 degree pathway, and they also need to report on their reductions. In one of the SBTI's progress reports, they disclosed that the typical company with science-based targets has reduced its direct Scope 1 and 2 emissions at a linear rate of 6.4% each year, and so they are aligned with the latest climate science. Therefore, it is of great importance to pursue net zero pathways and to focus on real reductions and not offsets. Now, the second trap I would like to guide you through is ignoring what you can't see. And what do I mean with that? To set targets and to achieve real carbon reductions, companies need an accurate greenhouse gas inventory. The first step towards that is measuring carbon emissions in all 3 scopes. Scope 1 and 2, which are emissions from fuel combustion and purchased energy, only take a small portion of a company's carbon footprint. Over 90% of emissions of a company usually comes from the value chain, which is called Scope 3. And Scope 3 consists of 15 different categories, and only when all applicable categories have been screened, it is possible to know which activities cause the highest emissions in a company's carbon footprint. Therefore, not measuring and ignoring certain categories that might be responsible for a large amount of carbon emissions can lead to greenwashing.
Thank you, Lucia, for going over trap number 1 and 2. Yes, I think at Normative, we really want to engage businesses to measure their scope 3 emissions, especially since over 90% of emissions are here. And that's why we really try to support businesses to engage their value chain and their supply chain. We also have the saying that you can't reduce what you don't measure, but measuring inaccurately can also be a trap of unintentional greenwashing. So I'd like to invite Dimitri Vaskovic, our climate strategy advisor, to walk us through traps 3 and number 4.
Trap number 3 is low quality data. It's not a secret that low quality data doesn't yield the most precise results. That's why you need to focus on collecting the most accurate data. And it's important to understand the difference between different types of data. There is a so-called spend data and there's so-called activity data. For example, you could use the amount of liters, which is an example of activity data, instead of amount of money that you spend on fuel. And similarly, for energy consumption, you could use the kilowatt hours instead of amount of money that you spend on purchasing this electricity or energy. Activity data is to prefer because it yields more accurate results. However, we recommend our customers to start with spend data assessment or a combination of both spend and activity data. Additionally, it's important to stay on track with the latest climate science, and that's why it's crucial to make sure that you use the most updated emission factors. And it's quite a time-consuming task to find the latest emission factors and to make sure that your report is up to date. That's why you can find a trusted partner such as Normative that will help you to stay updated. The next trap is trap number 4. It's lack of transparency. When you start calculating your emissions, you need to choose a reporting period. It can be from January to December or from April to March. It's up to you entirely. The only thing that you need to make sure is that you stick to the reporting period, that you report under the same cadence, so your reports are comparable. And you also need to make sure that legal entities and business units are stated in this report, so the reader knows what has been included in the report. Additionally, it's good to provide the breakdown of the categories in scope 1, 2, and especially scope 3 that consists in total of 15 categories. And if you exclude any categories in scope 3, you also need to specify why.
Thank you, Dimitri. I think for lack of transparency, some people may think that it's intentional, but a lot of times it can be unintentional, just because the carbon reporting and carbon legislation environment is so complex and it's moving so quickly. So it's difficult for businesses to keep up with all this. And on that note, actually, Normative has a free tool that helps businesses in just a few minutes with a quick survey to figure out what carbon legislation applies to them. So for not falling into this trap, it's definitely important to collaborate with the right partners and use the right tools. All right, so that was trap number 4, and now we're going to move to our final trap, and this one is about carbon offsetting. And this is a topic that is receiving a lot of hype right now because carbon offsetting is seen as positive and negative, and we'd like to bring our expert, Dr. Alexander Schmidt, to tell us about the quality of carbon offsetting.
Thank you so much, Maria. No, exactly. It is one of the most complex topics in this entire space. We heard from Lucia around the net zero targets, and of course, we do call it net zero because you need to, or this takes into account the fact that you will need to balance your residual emissions with projects that hopefully do remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it securely underground for as long as possible. At the same time, what has been shown in these first years, or maybe decade by now, that these projects are running, more than 80% of many recommended projects, they actually fail to reduce emissions that they have claimed to reduce. So again, you as a company, you have the best of intentions. You go out there, you purchase carbon credits, and you feel good about having done something and provide this into your sustainability report and say, I will be based on this net zero by, or right now my emission profile looks like this. However, the project that you have purchased that has not been properly screened before. This is a topic for a whole webinar, maybe even a whole lecture. We have done one 1 hour webinar in early March of this year. So do feel free to, or we would invite you to go back and look at those discussions going on in March in this webinar, because this is such a broad topic. So I will not do it justice in just 1 or 2 minutes. But in essence, what you need to be aware of in the projects is it about a project that just avoids emissions, meaning there would have happened emissions otherwise without the investment, or is the project actually and actively removing carbon from the atmosphere, and as I said before, stores it securely underground. There's a breadth of projects, obviously here, we just pointed out a few, such as biochar, direct air capture, but this is kind of the difficult space companies need to navigate and need to apply proper screening before they engage in purchasing, because ultimately you should always reduce first and only remove then what is left and what cannot be reduced in this very moment.
Thank you, Alex, for tackling this very complex topic in a few minutes. All right, so those were our traps number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And now I'd like to invite the entire panel so we can go over a Q&A segment. While I wait for a few more questions to roll in, I'm curious to know, which trap do businesses fall the most into?
I can take this one. I guess it's hard to pick one. I think all 5 are really important to consider when calculating the emissions and disclosing your emissions in reports. I would say that lack of transparency, especially unintentional, is quite significant because it's very important for your stakeholders to know what has been covered in your report and what has been included, what is excluded, and what is the methodology that you used to base your calculations on, and what approach have you used. So there are details that matter, and the more information you disclose, the better. So the readers can derive conclusions from your reports, and also to make sure that they're comparable, perhaps within the industry between different companies.
Okay, thank you, Zimisie. And now I'm going to move on to some audience questions. So the first one is, are we going to share the presentation afterwards? So yes, all our normative webinars are recorded and they will be on our website at normative.io/webinars. And we'll let you know when this one is out on our social media as well. So for our next question, do you have any recommendations for databases where I could find emissions factors? So I think I'd direct that question to Alex.
Actually, I do think that both Lucy and Zimisie are facing customers every day. They can definitely talk a bit about the product itself, where we, of course, try to get always the best databases in. I think just from my side, and then happy to hear a bit more from the customer-facing team here. From my side, what is important to understand it is one database will likely not get you there. So it is not that I can say, here's the URL and you're kind of good to go for this. This is what makes it actually so complex. And we do not say this to kind of, lure you into some more engagement with us here. No, it is for everyone the same. The stuff is just not be found in one database or on one URL. There are good databases to start with, especially Zimisie outlined the spend-based approach. There are also industry average databases. If you just want to get a feeling for where you stand, there are free tools and resources out there. But I think if you really want to go into nitty-gritty, you need to connect databases. And that is what makes this space so complex. But again, inviting Lucy and Zimisie, of course, to comment on this assessment.
Yes, I can add on to that, and it is exactly as Alex said. Every company is, very individual, has a range of business activities and products and services, and they all need to be matched with a suitable emission factor. And as my colleague pointed out, one database is not enough. It's really about connecting as many data points as possible to draw the right conclusions, and then provide you with a company carbon footprint that comes close to reality and really can give you a strong foundation to base your decisions upon.
Thank you, Lucia. Missy, do you have anything to add?
I couldn't agree more with everything that has been already mentioned. I also could recommend the companies that have fewer than 50 employees to use our free tool that is called Business Carbon Calculator to assess their emissions. So if you would like to start somewhere and to get a ballpark figure on your emissions, you can use our tool, and you can find more about it on our website.
All right, thank you. The next question we have is, which conversion factors are the best for calculating supply chain emissions? So Lucia, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, so a great interest in emission factors from the audience, I can tell, and it is justified because it is a complex area to navigate. And as we touched upon, like there is no one database that is the only source of truth. So that's something that we always keep in mind working with our clients, because you need to put the data into context, and then depending on the data set, the right emission factors need to be chosen, and then data needs to be treated in a certain way. So we do, working with our clients, always see the full picture.
Thanks, Lucia. Alex,
just to add to this, ultimately, I think what is really important when we talk about these database questions, it is a journey, as already Smithy and Lucia both pointed out. It is usually starting from a bird's eye view and then zooming in to really try to start where you can move the needle most. But then also about the value chain, it's about engagement. Ultimately, you will not find the right numbers just in one table. It is really about, you need to be really with, of course, your partner, you need to go in there and map out the value chain and engage properly with your suppliers until we have, of course, reached a network stage at which we can connect to all kind of entities out there. But until then, it is super important that you have a strategy behind this and you actually follow through with the strategy across your value chain, and not just looking into one or the other sheet on Excel, for example.
Exactly. Okay, our next question, a little bit related to the first one I had about which trap is the most common to fall into. The question is, which of the traps is the easiest to address with existing data and analytics? And which one is the most difficult? I'll leave the floor open for whoever wants to take that one.
I can take this one, and then maybe my colleagues can jump in and add on to that. So the traps go hand in hand. So I would like to start with the ones that I presented. So really seeing the full picture, like screening, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions accurately. That is the foundation to then later add on to that and develop targets that are actually aimed at real reductions. Because you need to be clear of where your emissions are coming from in order to address them. And then this closely links to then data quality and choosing the right consolidation approach, for example. So I might hand over to my colleague Smithy now to expand on that a bit further.
I would say that, of course, it's just easier to assess your reports when you already have some data in and have some previous experience. So you can assess what you're doing and also decide on the measures to improve your reporting. So after hearing all the traps that we've discussed, you can check the report that you're doing right now and see if you are transparent enough with the carbon inventory, your business units, methodology that you use. And when it comes to the quality of data, I think it's a good exercise, a good yearly exercise, if you report on a yearly basis, to assess if you need to expand your carbon inventory, if you need to include more categories, if you need to include more offices or business units in it. It's common that the changes happen, and it's also possible that some categories were not included in the beginning. And of course, we're all trying to figure out how to do it in the best and most efficient way. And as long as you become better throughout the years and you have a regular exercise to assess yourself and how solid your calculations are, how good your communication is, then I think it's the right way forward. And all traps are relevant for all the companies.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll move on to our next question. This is a more specific one. Looking at business supplies, for example, paper, pens, chairs, etc., how do our business, or how do we account for the volumes of multiple small items in deliveries? I think that's, a more specific question.
Yeah, I can take this one. So these are products that companies purchase. So this would fall under one of the scope 3 categories called purchased goods and services, which is usually a very emission intensive category. And there's different ways to assess those. So as Smitya pointed out, a spend-based assessment is a great starting point, because then those small items are shown by transactions in your financial data, and then adding an emission factor to those, you can get those first insights where your emissions are coming from. And then, for example, when you can clearly identify your top 10 emitting suppliers, then you can increase granularity, so you can look at the product level and assess activity data and really list the specific product you're purchasing from your suppliers, and then assess the emissions specifically to those items.
All right, thank you, Lucia.
I can expand on this, if I may. I would say that, of course, you can look into the data availability on the product level, as Lucia mentioned, and to see if you can integrate it with your data. However, not all the products have calculated emissions per product. There are millions of different products, so it's just not possible to find emissions per product, per specific product. So it's also possible to collect the data on materials that the products are made from. And if you're able to quantify the materials the products are made from, then it's also possible to calculate the emissions on material level. So there are different options how to go about the calculations. And of course, sometimes it's company specific, and in each case has to be treated separately.
Thank you. Okay, so we have time for one more question. So the questions that we don't get to because of time constraints, we'll definitely make sure to get back to you after the webinar. So the question is, how do you find the balance and not fall into either trap 2 and 3? If the source of emissions is in fact insignificant in the big picture, does it make sense to spend much time on improving data quality?
Yeah, maybe if we just take a bit of a bigger picture approach here, it comes down to, of course, channeling your energy into the areas where they really matter at this point in time. Ultimately, you need to have the goal in mind going net zero by 2050, the latest. So you do want to have everything mapped out and everything discovered and everything hopefully covered fully. However, as I think the question also was alluding to, it might not make sense to spend hours and hours of how can I, for example, reduce my ball pen use or office paper recycling. And if I actually purchase products or have activities up or downstream a value chain that emit a huge amount of carbon every day while I'm busy sorting through my pens and my paper. So I think it's really important that to get first a bird's eye view, but then not getting lost in the details, but really focus on here are my big emitters. And honestly, oftentimes those are a handful of big suppliers that make up half of your footprint. So it's easy to get a first foot in the door and say, okay, let's talk to them, or let's change some way of doing of engaging with them.
Thank you, Alex. And adding to that, is there any criteria that companies should follow as guidelines to assess a project that they consider investing in?
Should I continue this, or does Smithia?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, guidelines in general, we follow, and this is recommended, the gold standard, the greenhouse gas protocol that maps out the different categories and how to actually assess emissions in what order if you want, and which categories, and so on and so forth. Lucia was alluding to the scope 1, 2, 3 categories. Again, from our point of view, or everything we've seen, and also the data out there show that scope 3 is going to be the biggest bulk of emissions for most companies. So that's usually the part where companies end up focused on. But as to like frameworks and standards, you do have the greenhouse gas protocol as the standard. And then there are different approaches that can feed data into, this pipeline, so to speak. But ultimately, greenhouse gas protocol gives a good guiding framework for the whole carbon accounting space.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And thank you everyone for your questions. The ones that we did not get to, we'll be sure to reach out after the webinar and get back to you with answers. We do want to leave some time for a conclusion. So thank you once again to our panel. And so we've talked about the business consequences, the financial, legal, and reputational risks. We've talked about the 5 most common traps when it comes to unintentional greenwashing. So how do we close these gaps? How do we go forward? Alex, please take the floor.
Thank you so much. One last time, then I promise I'm also done. I think it's super important to, once more, take the high-level view and look at where are we going as not just one industry, but as the whole world. And I think it's fair to say, and everything we discussed today shows this clearly, the trend is towards more transparency and more accountability required from businesses. This can be seen in both regulations, so the frameworks are only going to increase in depth and in coverage of or requirements of companies. They need to cover their scope 3. This will be inevitable moving forward, meaning you need to know what is in your value chain in terms of emissions. Consumers, employees, they demand this, and ultimately also the financial market will more and more demand that if you apply for a loan, they need to know what is your carbon footprint, what is the risk that they buy into, so to speak, by giving you a loan. So we really see the systemic movement across the entire markets. What this means then, of course, is that if you go out there and if you make claims around your sustainability or environmental efforts, you need to know what to talk about. It does not suffice anymore to say we do something and this is in the fine print. You need to be really clear about what are my goals and where do I derive them from. And importantly, how can you talk about where you want to go in 2050, 2030 if you do not know the numbers that your company has right now? This would be exactly the wrong approach, starting with, here's my target, and then I have to figure out how to do this. It should be, let's figure out where I stand right now, and let's take the appropriate steps to be aligned with science. So for this, it's so important that you start with comprehensive coverage of all of your emissions across all of your 3 scopes. You intelligently automate your process of mapping out and improving the data quality, and then ultimately reducing your emissions across your entire value chain. This means also taking out many of the manual Excel sheets and moving this into a platform that is powerful enough to give you this overview. And lastly, with the rapidly evolving environment, both regulatory side, but also the scientific side, we just heard science-based targets, they have adjusted the framework on which you can set targets. It is so important that you stay up to speed. And again, this might be very, very difficult for a company to do on its own. So that's why companies like Normative are therefore there to help you and to guide you all the way.
Thank you, Alex. So I think in a nutshell, to avoid unintentional greenwashing is to have rigorous carbon accounting and net zero commitments. All right, everyone. So we're almost nearing the end of our webinar. I just wanted to say thank you so much for making time and for providing so many questions. We had more than 30 questions come in, and unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer all of them today. So we will be sure from our side to reach out to you. If you would like to reach out to us or find out more information, please visit us at normative.io and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Once again, thank you so much to our expert panel for making time today and sharing their expertise with us. On our website as well, you can find our past webinar recordings as well as other free tools to help you on your career, including a value chain engagement guide and a free carbon legislation tracker tool to help you see what carbon legislation applies to your business. From my end, thank you once again for making time to join us today on this webinar on unintentional greenwashing. And last but not least, before we leave, I'd like you to take just 1 minute when the webinar ends to answer a quick survey to see how we did today in our webinar. We're always looking for ways to improve our webinar experience, and it would mean so much to us for you to get back to us with your feedback. So thank you once again, and have a great day.